Okay. Can someone kindly let me know if they can see the presentation? No speaker notes.
Correct. We can see the slides only and not all of your notes.
Okay, great. I will go ahead and jump in. So first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak about my work. And I want to thank you all for being here today, especially those who made the last minute change. But if there's anything that COVID taught us, it was about being flexible. So I'm Amy Kinsley. I'm an assistant professor and an aquatic epidemiologist in the veterinary population medicine department in the College of Veterinary Medicine. I'm also a research fellow at MACER, which is the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, and I'm an associate with the Institute on the Environment. And today I'm going to share a bit of my work where I've integrated knowledge and approaches from multiple disciplines to address challenges related to aquatic invasive species prevention. But before I delve into the details of the work, I just kind of want to set the broader context of my research. And so at a very broad level, I say that my mission is to enhance human, environmental, and animal health through the protection of natural resources and sustainable aquaculture and fisheries. And in large part, I work towards this mission by trying to understand mechanisms of infectious diseases, invasive species, and pollution spread in aquatic environments. And though infectious diseases can be classified as an invasive species, I generally separate them because I do apply approaches that have been traditionally used to study infectious diseases to non-infectious invasive species. And I'll talk a bit more of that when we move on. But when I'm focusing on an infectious disease, I usually start by considering how the host and the pathogen interact and ways that lead to disease within a host, and then how that might contribute to spread within a population. And I use compartmental modeling techniques or network modeling techniques to understand dynamics of the disease within the population and explore how to more efficiently and effectively manage the disease or assess the risk of spread to other populations and how that risk changes over time. So for example, I have a figure in the lower left corner that's showing results from a compartmental model where the population is distributed into different disease categories over time. So you can see in the green, there are the susceptible. In blue, I have latently infected. So that means they're infected, but they're not showing clinical signs and aren't infectious. Subclinically infected, so they're infected with no clinical signs, but are infectious, clinically infected, and then recovered. And then on the x-axis, I describe the days since the disease introduction into the population, and in the y-axis, describe the number of animals for those different compartments. And we can see here when we focus on the red and the orange lines representing those infected individuals, that the population that's being modeled would generate an epidemic or a higher number of cases than we would expect that would last about 40 days before we see that kind of burning out or that line kind of going back down to that zero level. But for the same pathogen in a population where it has different attributes, it could lead to an outbreak that looks more like this, where there's waves of infection that continue on. And in a disease situation like this, it might become endemic or continually serve as a source of infection for other populations. And then I also use information about connectivity to assess how disease spread occurs between populations. Here I'm showing a pathogen spreading between populations through rivers or streams or maybe currents if we're thinking about net pens of fish in the ocean. Of course, through other human-mediated routes or through human-mediated routes. And in the figure in the lower left corner, I'm showing networks representing the connectivity of two populations. So we can imagine one population is in purple and one population is in that teal color. And then in A, we can see that the individuals in the population are well connected amongst themselves, but there's really no connectivity between those two populations. Where then if we look over at B, we can see that there's a high level of overlap. And if we were to say that A represents potential spread of contaminated water between populations, let's say, and B represents direct contact or individuals in physical contact, we could say that pathways B results in a higher level of connectivity that might lead to transmission between populations versus the scenario that we see in A. And we can use the structure of the connectivity in B, where we can identify individuals. If we imagine that each of those little circles are individuals, or we imagine that they're individuals within their population, where we could apply vaccination or preventative therapy, or if we were looking at using antibiotics judiciously, right, that we would not need to treat the whole entire population, but maybe we could treat a subset based on the knowledge of that structure. And so the goal of my work is not only to advance our theoretical understanding of these topics, but also to inform policy, to develop resource allocation plans, or contribute to planning and preparedness activities. And so to translate my work in action, I engage with a variety of other folks like natural resource managers, policymakers, and other researchers and veterinarians. And much of my work right now is actually focused on aquatic invasive species, or AIS, which again includes harmful microbes or pathogens, but it also includes invasive fish, invertebrates, and aquatic plants. And AIS are important. They're important because they're a major threat to aquatic ecosystems. They lead to impacts through competition with native species. They cause alterations in food webs and habitats, and changes in water quality, amongst other mechanisms. And in Minnesota, work around AIS prevention and management is quite unique because it largely takes place at the state and the local level. And so at the state level, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources invasive species program, they work to prevent introductions of new invasive species into the state. And then they also work to prevent further spread of invasive species that are already here. And then at the local level, counties work with other local government units to limit the spread of invasive species within each county. And what's unique is that this work is largely supported by the AIS Prevention Aid that distributes $10 million a year amongst counties. That's based on the number of watercraft trailer launches and parking spaces. And so a common prevention activity that counties rely on is watercraft inspections. They use them to mitigate spread by inspecting and decontaminating boats as they enter and exit lakes. And then they also use watercraft inspections as an opportunity to educate boaters on AIS prevention and hoping they clean their boats when an inspector isn't present at a lake. But there's a lot of challenges in developing and implementing effective AIS programs for these counties, given limited resources. And one of those challenges is the vast number of lakes that exist here in Minnesota. Another challenge is the large number of recreational boats that move across the landscape. And Minnesota has an estimated 880,000 registered boats, and that was in 2019. And just thinking about those moving across all of the lakes really gives you an idea of the magnitude of this issue, right? And so since freshwater AIS remain viable over between lakes on boats, or some species do, it can be really challenging to manage the spread from lake to lake. So with these challenges, it led to a partnership between AIS county managers. And so here I've labeled some of the ones that were really initiating a few years ago in partnering with UMN researchers around watercraft inspection planning. And that was Crow Wing, Meeker, and Stearns in Ramsey County. And that started some one-on-one consultations where I worked with a collaborator, Robert Haight, who's a forest researcher with USDA Forest Service, and Nick Phelps, who's the director of MACERC. And we developed approaches to support managers with decisions about where to place their watercraft inspectors, given that their budget wouldn't allow them to place inspectors at every lake in their county. And so to do this, we developed a model that was based on integer linear programming, which is an approach that's commonly used in operations research, economics, and engineering. And so just to dive in briefly to this approach, an integer linear programming problem is formulated as a model, and it generally has an objective function, some decision variables, and some constraints. So I'll dig into what that means in this context. So our objective was to select lakes for inspection stations to maximize the number of risky boats that are inspected. And so we defined a risky boat as one that moves from an infested lake to an uninfested lake. And then in this study, we focused on zebra mussels, starry stonewort, and Eurasian water milfoil. And so our decision variables were to include whether a lake was inspected or not. And then we considered constraints of a budget. So we knew that we couldn't put the inspectors at every lake, right? And then we use optimization software to find the best combination of decision variables that satisfy the constraints and optimize the objective function. And so here I'm showing a table on the right that's an example of a model output, and it shows the top 10 locations for Stearns County. So we can see at the top location, we see there Rice Lake, and that's then followed by Coronis and so on. And so that's how we read that. At the bottom, it shows the proportion of boats that are inspected by putting inspectors at that lake or those lakes, given the different scenarios. And ultimately, counties were appreciative of this approach, and we wanted to share it with counties across the state. And we realized that with 87 counties, one-on-one consultations wouldn't really be feasible, and that our model outputs would be constantly changing as new lakes became infested. And so also we knew that our integer linear programming model was computationally intense. So even if we could do one-on-one consultations with all of the counties, we wouldn't have the capacity to run them for every updated infestation status for all of the counties. And so it prompted us to look for new methods or new approaches. And so in order to share the ideas in this further, we developed a network algorithm. So that's based on some of the concepts that I was sharing about. It's kind of like a mainstay of my research that were similar to what we had produced with the integer linear programming approach. But the network algorithm that we generated ran much quicker, and it didn't need any specialized software. So the algorithm was generated in R, which is a free open source programming language, and most of you are probably familiar with R, and that it can be used to generate our Shiny apps, or these interactive web applications. And so what we did, or essentially the way the algorithm runs, is that it ranks lakes, or if we put that in network terms, we call them nodes. And we classify those or rank those based on the number of risky boats that lake sends or receives. And then the highest node is recorded and then removed from the network, meaning that those risky boat connections to other lakes are no longer considered in the algorithm. And so we continue this node by node until there's no more connections. And the figure here I'm showing is an example of how it works. And we call this like a toy network, and what those outputs might look like there at the bottom in part E. And so the figure shows an example where the water body 2 had the highest number of risky boats entering or exiting. And if you placed an inspector there, you would inspect almost 86% of the risky boats in the county, which is quite high. We don't actually see numbers like that for one lake within a county, but this is just a toy network kind of showing what that might look like. And so to connect this more broadly with our county managers, we connected with folks at a company called Epi Interactive, and they specialize in data visualization. And we worked with an epidemiologist, graphic designer, a computer scientist, and a software engineer. And this web decision support tool enables end users to visualize the model outputs. They can see it as a list or a map, and then they also have an option to visualize it as a chart that describes the relationship between the number of inspection stations and risky boats inspected. And so as you kind of compare these outputs to the figure that I showed before, you can imagine that it's much easier for users to interact with and experience outputs like this. And what's also really great about this tool is that if a lake becomes infested and is reported on the DNR's infested waters list, the app connects directly with that. And so those are automatically updated. And so it checks twice a day and updates the model outputs accordingly. So to share the dashboard with our stakeholders, we held a series of workshops, and we wanted to inform them of the tool. We wanted to train them in its use and build trust with them by sharing more information about details and methods and what our model assumptions were and what some of the limitations were, which is really important in approaches like this because we know that our model outputs aren't true reflections of the real world, and that outputs need to be integrated with local knowledge for decision making. And it was really helpful to go back and forth with folks who actually make decisions and our managers and get feedback about some of the assumptions we're making, and even in some places, some errors that we had in the data that we had collected from other sources. But it was through our work with these county managers and developing AIS Explorer that we started asking questions about the impact of fragmenting the state into the county programs and what that might, the impact that might have on efficiency, and if we could impact that potentially by strategic collaboration amongst counties. And so to answer these questions, we aim to identify efficient placement of watercraft inspectors throughout the state. So we're just imagining that there's no county boundaries anymore. We also quantified the inefficiency that might arise when planning occurs at two levels, so at the state and county levels. And we developed a bi-level planning approach for that, and I'll expand on that further. We developed an approach to identify counties that could collaborate to increase the efficiency of county level planning. And then we made updates to our dashboard, AIS Explorer, in an effort to promote collaboration. So similar to the previous work, we developed a set of integer programming models, and the models compared statewide and countywide scenarios. We looked at starry stonewort, zebra mussels, Eurasian water milfoil as species of interest. And then when we moved into the collaboration, we added another invasive species, spiny water flea. It was one of concern. And we looked at statewide, we added a countywide, and we looked at a collaboration scenario. And I'll walk you through some of those methods here. So for the first three objectives, and even the work that I shared initially that kind of kicked us off, we used boater networks that were created from the Minnesota Watercraft Inspection Survey data. So from this statewide system that was collected from 2014 to 2017 that estimated the annual movement of boats between lakes in Minnesota, and that included 9,182 lakes. The network was based on outputs from a machine learning algorithm, and that was informed. We had over 1,600,000 survey responses. So when boaters are entering or exiting lakes, they are asked their last location and where they're planning to go next. And so we use that survey data. And it was able to account for uninspected lakes and was adjusted to account for bias and unequal effort. So we have inspectors that are out, that are observing, collecting survey data, and doing inspections, but that's only a subset of the lakes that we're including here in our study, and obviously a subset of the lakes in the state. And so through these machine learning algorithms, we were able to overcome that and look at every potential pair of lakes in the state and make predictions about whether those were connected or not. And so the models then were also informed by the DNR infested waters list. So it's a list of invasive species lakes and whether there is an invasive species present. And that was used to create this definition, or what I had referred to before as risky boat movements, those that are moving from infested to uninfested lakes. And here in the figure on the right, I'm showing that a risky boat is one that moves yes, from an infested to uninfested lake, but that this considers species and the differences there, right? So two lakes might be infested, but if it's not infested with the species that we're investigating, then we're considering it uninfested, right? And that's what I'm showing here. So here's an overview of the state level and bi-level model. As you can see in the state level model, a state planner selects lakes for inspection stations, and that the goal there is to maximize the number of rescue boats inspected within a given budget, right? So that's that scenario where we have no county boundaries under consideration anymore. And then in the bi-level model, there's two different steps there. So in the first step, each county planner develops a set of optimal plans, and they're trying to optimize the inspection of rescue boats in their county. And then in the second step, the state planner comes and selects a plan from each county that maximizes the rescue boats when considering the whole state, right? And here are the results from those. The statewide and bi-level model with the number of lakes selected for inspection on the x-axis and the number of rescue boats for that are inspected on the y-axis. And we found that like the state level model, the number of rescue boats inspected in the bi-level model increases, but with diminishing returns. And there were less risky boats inspected than the statewide model. We also observed that almost all the rescue boats are inspected by selecting over 700 lakes, and that 600,000 rescue boats were inspected in the bi-level scenario when we looked at a budget level of 400, which is about 17% less than what we would get with the state level model. And so these findings are important because our statewide modeling approach can serve as a baseline to evaluate the efficiency of actual or proposed inspection locations. And we also found that the bi-level approach to resource allocation wasn't as efficient as the optimal statewide coordination, and that inefficiency wasn't trivial, right? So then for the third objective, where we wanted to look and see if counties could collaborate to increase efficiency. There's no incentive for counties to collaborate, right? There's no external incentive for them to collaborate. So for this, we aim to identify win-win scenarios between pairs of counties that could establish groups. So let's take, for example, County A and County B here, right? There's 4 possible outcomes that could arise when considering a pairwise relationship. We can say that County A and County B are not connected, meaning right, there's no risky boats that move between those counties. Or we could say County A sends risky boats to County B. Or we could say that County B sends risky boats to County A. Or we could say County A and County B send risky boats to each other. And if they do, we consider this a reciprocal relationship, and we are setting up a potential win-win situation for both counties. So for each county in Minnesota, we identified the number of risky boats traveling outside that county, and then we rank them based on the sending county. So for example, here we have County A, and we can see that the top 3 sources of risky boats are County B, County C, and County D. And for County B, the top sources are County A, County C, and County D. And since B receives the highest number of rescue boats from A and A from B, we classified this as a reciprocal relationship. And we represented that as a line that exists between the two counties, right? So we're creating a network here in this way. So if we extended this concept, or if we extend this concept beyond the top senders to the top 3 senders, and we include some more counties, we can see that more of these relationships become apparent, right? We see A and B along with D and B, and we also see C and D as connections. And I try to match those up with these colored check marks. But let's take a moment from what I showed before with the 2 circles and the line connecting them. Let's take a moment and consider what that might look like as a network. So if you don't have a pen and paper, you can just think in your mind, like, how would those be connected? Or if you want to draw it out, I'll give you a second to kind of map that out. As you go through, you might have come up with something like this, either in your mind on your piece of paper, where County A and B are connected, B and D are connected, and D and C are connected. And you can see how we're starting to create this network in this way. And that was just conceptual. But we did this for all the counties in the state, and we started with the top sender and worked our way down the ranking list until we ended up with one large group. And so for the first ranking, we observed one pair, and that included Carver and Hennepin County. For the second ranking, we had 3 groups. We had Carver, Hennepin, Wright, Crow and Cass and Ramsey. Crow and Cass and Ramsey in Washington. For the third, we saw a group of Carver, Hennepin, Wright, Crow and Cass Stearns, Anoka, Ramsey, Washington. So they're starting to get larger and kind of taking shape as we start to expand out what rankings we're considering in these networks, until we end up with one large group again at the 5th ranking, which just tells us something about the connectivity and how highly connected the system really is when we think about boats moving between counties. But because we know that one large group of 15 individuals will be really challenging when we think about collaboration and planning, we decided that we would focus on just the top 3 senders that had an average group size of about 4.5 to carry forward what some of this might look like, or what we could do with some work like this. And so this figure shows the risky boat movements that shaped those potential collaborations when we were looking at the top 3 senders. And so here in this image on the left, for each county that is listed on the outside of the circle, the outermost ring determines the color that represents the number of risky boats coming from that county. Then the line that spans across the circle represents risky boats that move into another county. So for example, if we look at the big purple line moving across the circle, that represents boats moving from Crow Wing County into Cass. And then that black line shows the boats moving from Cass into Crow Wing County, right? And that shows a bit more about how these relationships were formed between these groups of counties. And so the thicker the line, the more boats are moving. From this, we really saw 2 collaborations form. In the upper right side of the figure, we can see we have Ramsey, Anoka, and Washington as a collaboration. And then we also see, below that, we see Crow and Carver, Wright, Hennepin, Cass, and Stearns. And we took these and we asked how could these collaborations impact watercraft inspection program efficiency by using these within a collaboration scenario. And so we turned back to our integer programming approach, and here's what we saw. Again, on this graph, we have on the x-axis the number of inspection stations or locations. And on the y-axis, we have the number of risky boats inspected. In the orange, we have the results of the statewide scenario. Then in the purple, we have a collaboration scenario. And in the blue, we see our countywide scenario. And here we can see that the statewide scenario outperforms the collaboration and the countywide scenario for all of the budget levels. And in the statewide scenario, just as we saw in objectives 1 and 2, the number of risky boats observed peaked at about 400 locations, and that significant gains were really observed by placing more than that. The collaboration scenario resulted in more risky boat inspections than the county-based scenario, and it outperformed it by about 65,000 more risky boats when we looked at that budget level of 400, which is about 8% of the possible risky boats, indicating that collaborations between counties may be a way that could build on the benefits of local level initiatives while also increasing efficiency. And so to share this work and help promote collaboration, we incorporated our ideas from this work into the online dashboard that I shared earlier, AS Explorer. And if we go to the tab that showed the watercraft inspection planning tab before, we now see that there's 2 new options. In the first, there's a collaborations. We're calling these sub-tabs that come up if you select a county that's included in a collaboration network that was generated from this work. And then there's also a paired planning tab. In the collaboration sub-tab, it shows how what the counties are, what those county collaborations are, and the structure of those and how they were generated. And it's really showing those strongest connections. It's not showing all of the connections, just to show like who is it that we found the strongest win-win match with that is bringing you to the table, right? And then if you look on the right, it shows lakes. These are the top 50 lakes in the counties within that potential collaboration network, and they're colored matching their counties. So you can see how the structure of the connection of the lakes is really driving this collaboration network. And so here we have those little circles or all those lakes, and then the lines between them show if there's risky boat movements that occur. We really didn't include any more detail than do risky boats travel between the lakes. Some visualizations of networks can show these connections with thicker lines, showing that there's more movement, or thinner lines, meaning less, but it just becomes kind of overwhelming to include too much of a descriptor in here, but folks can end up seeing valuable information as they progress. So as you scroll down the page, there's a group planning output. And so what that does is it ranks the location for watercraft inspection stations, just like the current tab does, only now if the counties were included in a potential collaboration, it kind of considers that with all of those boundaries broken down. And then if you go further down the page, there's this paired planning where counties can select lakes for inspection stations and see how inspecting those lakes might affect their county that they're collaborating with. So if I place inspectors at a few of my very popular lakes, does that decrease the flow of risky boats potentially into some of your lakes that you would have been inspecting, and help kind of maybe mitigate some redundancy within inspections? And so just like we did for the initial release of AS Explorer, we're planning on holding workshops in late fall and winter to share the updates with stakeholders and get feedback from them about the changes. Some of this work that I've shared in the past at some of the research showcases. So if folks want to dive in further there, they can get more information. And I'm always happy to answer questions if folks want to reach out and chat about it. We're currently working to update our networks that inform the modeling work that I showed. We use networks that were constructed from watercraft inspection data that was collected from 2014 to 2017. And so we now have data from 2018 to 2020 that we're working on and are comparing. We aim to dig into some aspects of temporality and ask questions about how movement patterns change across years. We hope to make comparisons to data collected from other sources, so things like mobile apps, and we're expanding our work to look at game theory approaches. And so that's in collaboration with some industrial engineers at Virginia Tech and at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And so for those that are kind of new to the topic of game theory, it's a branch of math and economics that deals with studying strategic decision making, and it's been used as a framework for analyzing and understanding interactions and conflicts between decision makers. And so we're hoping to dive in deeper to some of these questions about potential collaborations. So there were a variety of folks who worked on this, coming from different disciplines, who I want to reach out or express my gratitude for, and also the stakeholders who gave us valuable feedback on this work through the years. These are most of the folks who were working on the collaboration work with us. And then with that, I'll take some questions, and then I see we have a ton of extra time. So I also included some other screenshots of some other updates or other components to AS Explorer that we could chat about if folks wanted to hear. But at this point, I'll just kind of pause and see if folks have questions.
Here. Questions in Duluth? So Amy, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question. How is licensing done for someone who doesn't fish? Our boats are licensed, I assume, and do you also have a separate license for fishing from that boat or from the shore?
Yeah,
Um, and is it done at the county or the state level?
so that's a good question. Also not particularly an area that I'm an expert in, but there's a fishing license that's separate from watercraft registration. So the watercraft will be registered, but then if you were fishing, you would get a fishing license, and that's happening at the state level.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I see a hand.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if the model is at all targeted to specific invasive species, or if it's just any species at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of added bits in there, but I went through it really quickly. And so I think that was a point that maybe got lost. So I'm glad that you asked it. So here we were focusing on invasive species that are known to spread between lakes through the boater movement pathway. And so most of the work included zebra mussels, starry stonewort, and Eurasian water milfoil. So bivalve, freshwater bivalve, macroalga, an invasive plant. But then we also added spiny water flea, a zooplankton that we know is spread through the boater pathway as like awareness grew about that. And so I'm sharing a lot of work in kind of a dense amount of time, but this really unfolded kind of through the years. And so that's why we've kind of added different species. So if you go into the dashboard, you can select what invasive species you're interested in. And so you can look at any one of those, or you can look at all, or a variety of combinations. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
Go ahead, Rob.
Are there any parameters that take into account like how long of a time it is between a boat being in an infected lake versus a non-infected lake? Or is it kind of just assuming that the boat goes directly into its next lake?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We didn't account for that duration because, as you can imagine, the longer amount of time a boat is out of the water, the lower that risk is. So we didn't quite get to that level. We didn't have individual, we weren't really using individual boater level data either. I didn't really get into the networks and like a ton of detail. We're kind of functioning off this idea of this aggregated annual number of boats that are moving between lakes. And so that's what we've got from the machine learning algorithms that generated those networks. So we're not actually following, we're using those surveys about where boaters were and where they go next to determine if lakes are connected, right? You can imagine if you're doing a survey at one lake and you ask them where they were last, that is a potential connection. And then you ask them where they're going next, and that's a potential connection. We kind of aggregate that amongst boaters. And then within there, I think there may have been something that took the raw data that said, okay, we're only looking within this time frame, like within a couple of weeks, but we don't get in any deeper than that and say, if you moved within a day, you're more risky than if you moved within a couple of months in the same season. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
And very roughly, what are the timescales of viability? It's not hours, it's like days or weeks, or?
Yeah,
I'm sure it's species dependent too.
species dependent, also not particularly something that is in the area of my expertise, but I think like a couple, like 3 weeks or so is about the idea where we're thinking that risk probably drops off.
Gotcha.
Obviously never to zero, but yeah.
Peter.
I was wondering, with the amount of tourism on lakes in Ontario, just across the Minnesota border, has there been any interest in using these sorts of tools to, slow or prevent spread of invasives across international borders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a question that comes up quite a bit, not necessarily across international borders, but particularly across states, and whether we are looking at movements between states, and we aren't, right? We're looking at those movements between Minnesota. But I think that's something that is coming as we continue to expand out this work, starting to understand more about connections to Wisconsin. We have access to the Wisconsin Watercraft Inspection Program data, and also thinking about ways where we can kind of augment the data that we currently have. So I talked a bit about mobile apps, but I think that's an area where we're really looking to move in the future. And there's a variety of other folks who are working on questions like that as well, thinking about like regional models as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point and a great question.
Are there questions from other participants online? So I have one more, and that is, are there voluntary pathways for getting this information into databases, or is the concern that only good citizens would volunteer data and you end up with a biased data set?
Oh, you mean if folks were to self-report?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the things I want to do moving forward is a more comprehensive survey of voters, asking them about where they go, and also maybe describing a bit more about what drives that behavior and how they make those decisions. I think that would be an interesting area to explore, is if you could go in and log your travel patterns. I mean, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think if we think about if that might be bias, sure, I think it could be, but I think we could also think of ways we can overcome some of the bias in data sets like that. I also think of, if we have faulty or erroneous data, right, can we make something fruitful come of that versus no data at all, if we at least understand a bit of maybe what some of those biases might be. So I don't think that that's a terrible idea at all. I think it's kind of within the realm of where I'm hoping to go for next steps for my work, is getting down to that voter level.
Other questions here in Duluth? Well, in which case, Amy, on behalf of the WRS program, thanks for taking some time out of your day.
Yeah, of course.
About AAS with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for coming, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or you want to chat further.
Great. Thanks
Yeah.
again.